I'm starting to sew for fall and winter months once again, and new look 6644 was first on my list. I made it in this sweater fleece. It turned out so well, I've already lined up a few other fabrics to sew a few more. You'll notice in the video today that I'm not finishing my raw edges as this material does not fray. I'll also note that I'm using a narrow zigzag stitch with a width of 0.5 and length of 2.5 everywhere except at the bottom of the neckband, where I briefly changed to a regular straight stitch there for more precision. Thanks for joining me in sewing today. I'm sure you'll want to make a few versions of this sweater as well. Let's get started. Place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together at the shoulder seams. To stabilize the shoulders so that they don't overstretch over time, you can sew hem tape into these seams. I'm going to cut pieces of hem tape to fit the shoulders, and you want the hem tape to be centered on top of the seam line. Then we can pin in place through all layers. Then sew your shoulder seams with your 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now before moving forward, we want to stabilize the V for the front bodice piece. Following the stitching guide on your pattern piece, we're going to sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance on either side of the bottom of the V. Starting 1 inch away from the bottom of the V on one side, pivoting at the dot, and then continuing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance 1 inch away from the bottom of the V on the opposite side. Now that V is reinforced, we're going to use sharp scissors to clip to but not through the stitching line at the bottom of the V. Fold your neckband in half right sides together, matching the short edges, and pin in place. Sew around that triangle with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to get a clean pivot at the dot transferred from your pattern piece. Now that that's sewn, once again, we're going to use sharp scissors to clip to the bottom of the V to the stitching line and not beyond. Now we can fold the neckband in half, wrong sides together, and give it a good press. So here's what my neckband looks like at this point, and I've gone ahead and marked the center back and the dots just using pins. Now I'll start pinning the neckband to the neckline right sides together, matching my center backs, and those 2 dots on either side of the center back will line up with the shoulder seams. I'll also align the seam line of the neckband at the center of the V on the bodice and pin in place. And then continue pinning one side of the neckline. Then I can pivot the fabric at the bottom of that V, and the snip that we made into the fabric at the bottom of the V on the bodice will help that fabric spread apart and allow us to smoothly pin on both sides. Now I have that neckband pinned all the way around, and I'm going to be sewing from the wrong side of the fabric. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the neckline, using a zigzag stitch with a width of 0.5 and a length of 2.5. Once I made my way around and I was at the bottom of the V, I switched my stitching to a regular straight stitch, so I was able to stitch right on top of those original stabilizing stitches. Now working from the wrong side of the fabric once again, we're going to sew around the neckband once again, this time 1/4 of an inch away from the original stitching line. This strengthens and creates a little bit of a finish for our seam allowance. Now we can trim away any excess seam allowance beyond that second row of stitching. Now I'll press that seam allowance all the way around toward the bodice. Now we're going to sew from the outside once more around the neckline, this time just underneath the main neckband seam line. I'm going to be using a narrow zigzag stitch once again. Now I'll place my front and back bodice pieces right sides together once again, and I'll pin both of the side seams. Then I'm going to sew with a narrow zigzag stitch and a 5/8 inch seam allowance on both sides, and I'm going to press my seams open. The hem allowance for the bottom of the sleeve is 3/4 of an inch, so I'm going to go ahead and fold up that hem allowance and give it a good press. Then we can open out that fold for now and fold the sleeve in half right sides together, matching the underarm seam, and pin in place. Repeat for your other sleeve, creating your memory crease along the bottom and pinning the underarm seam. Now I'm going to sew both of those seams with a narrow zigzag stitch and a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to turn my sleeve right side out, and I'll fold my bottom hem back up along its memory crease, and I'm going to sew the hem in place, edge stitching close to the raw edge all the way around with a zigzag stitch of a 2.5 width and 2.5 length. I'm going to place each of my sleeves right sides together with their corresponding armholes and pin in place, matching the dots and the notches. And pin in place for both sleeves. Note that you will be stretching the bodice material slightly so that the sleeve fits in place. Now, just as we did for the neckline, we're going to sew the armhole twice. First with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and a narrow zigzag stitch. Then we'll sew that same stitch once again 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching within the seam allowance. And lastly, to remove some of the bulk at the underarm, I'm going to trim away some of that seam allowance just above that second row of stitching from notch to notch along the underarm. Doing this for both underarms. Place the hem bands right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now we can fold the hemband wrong sides together and press all the way around. Place the hemband and the bottom of the bodice right sides together and pin all the way around, matching the side seams. Also match your notches and note that you will be stretching the hemband to fit the bottom of the bodice. Now we're going to sew the hemband to the bottom of the bodice using your preferred stretch stitch. I'm going to be using my serger. If you've also serged your seam, all you have to do is press that seam allowance up toward the bodice. But if you've sewn that hemband using your regular machine, you're going to want to reinforce those stitches once again, just as we did for the sleeves, this time sewing 1/4 of an inch away from the original stitching line within the seam allowance. Then you can trim any excess seam allowance and press it up toward the bodice as well. And now the sweater is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.